The shuttle's landing thrusters kicked up a storm of crystalline dust that made Alina Vasquez's eyes water, though she suspected that had more to do with the 3 cups of synthetic coffee she'd consumed during the 6-hour descent than any atmospheric irritants. She pressed her nose against the porthole and whistled low. Well, I've seen some fancy neighborhoods in my time, but this takes the cake. The Zephyrian capital stretched before them like something a particularly ambitious architect might dream up after eating too much cheese before bed. Towers spiraled impossibly upward, defying every law of physics Alina remembered from her engineering courses, their surfaces catching the binary sunset in ways that made her wonder if the buildings themselves were alive. Energy cascades flowed between the structures like luminous waterfalls, and she could swear some of the smaller spires were rotating slowly, as if they couldn't decide which direction looked prettiest. "Ambassador," her aide Marcus whispered urgently, "perhaps we should review the cultural protocols one more time." Alina waved him off with the confidence of someone who had once successfully negotiated a construction contract with the notoriously difficult Martian mining consortium. "Marcus, relax. How hard can it be? They're humanoid, they speak standard through their translators, and they want to trade. The rest is just fancy window dressing." The shuttle touched down with a gentle bump that suggested Zephyrian landing technology was considerably more advanced than anything Earth had managed. Through the viewports, Alina could see figures approaching across the landing platform, their movements fluid and purposeful. Her first glimpse of actual Zephyrians made her blink twice. They looked remarkably human, except for their ears, which curved elegantly from their heads like delicate shells, giving them an almost ethereal appearance. "Huh," she murmured. "They look like someone crossed humans with Art Nouveau furniture." The delegation that greeted them at the shuttle ramp moved with a grace that made Alina suddenly conscious of her own tendency to lumber when tired. The lead figure, whose ears caught the light with an opalescent sheen, stepped forward with what Alina assumed was a welcoming smile. "Ambassador Vasquez," the Zephyrian said, his voice carrying musical undertones that the translator couldn't quite capture. "I am Court Liaison Varen. We welcome you to Zephyros Prime." He moved closer, raising his hands toward her face in what looked like an attempt at intimacy that made Alina's diplomatic training kick into high alert. "Whoa there, friend," Alina said, taking a step back and extending her hand for a shake instead. "Let's keep things professional, shall we?" The change in the Zephyrians was immediate and dramatic. Varen's opalescent ears flattened against his head, and the other members of the welcoming committee took sharp steps backward. A murmur ran through the group that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Oh," Marcus breathed behind her, "oh no." Alina glanced back at him. "What? I just maintained appropriate boundaries. That's diplomacy 101. "Ambassador," Varen said carefully, his voice now carrying harmonics that suggested he was either very sad or possibly having digestive issues, "you have declined the greeting of honored equals." "The what now?" Alina looked around at the increasingly uncomfortable faces surrounding her. "Look, I'm sure it's a lovely greeting, but where I come from, we generally shake hands when we first meet. Nothing personal." The walk to the palace gave Alina time to appreciate just how thoroughly she'd managed to step in it. The Zephyrian escort maintained a respectful distance that felt more like quarantine protocols than courtesy, and Varen spent the entire journey speaking in rapid, musical bursts into what appeared to be a crystalline communication device. "Marcus," she whispered, "on a scale of 1 to we're all going to die horribly, how bad was that greeting thing?" Marcus consulted his datapad with the frantic efficiency of a man looking up the symptoms of a terminal disease. "According to my cultural files, the greeting of honored equals involves touching foreheads as a sign of mutual respect and, oh dear." "Oh dear what?" "Refusing it is traditionally interpreted as declaring the other party unworthy of respect." Marcus's voice climbed an octave, It's considered one of the gravest insults possible in Zephyrian society. Alina stopped walking. You're kidding. I am not kidding. I am the opposite of kidding. I am the anti-kid. Well, Alina said, resuming her stride, at least things can't get any worse. The throne room proved her wrong on multiple levels. It soared overhead like a crystalline cathedral, filled with floating platforms and energy displays that created a light show worthy of the galaxy's most expensive nightclub. Courtiers with those distinctive elongated ears moved through the space with the sort of fluid grace that suggested they'd been choreographed by someone with very strong opinions about aesthetics. At the center of it all sat the queen on a throne that appeared to be carved from a single piece of meteoric stone. She was beautiful in the way that made Alina suddenly aware that her diplomatic uniform had acquired several wrinkles during the journey, and her ears swept back from her head like elegant wings. But it was the figure standing beside the throne that made Alina's stomach perform an unscheduled gymnastics routine. Commander Kairos was built like someone had decided that regular human proportions weren't quite intimidating enough and had made adjustments accordingly. His ceremonial armor pulsed with inner light, creating patterns that seemed to shift when Alina wasn't looking directly at them. His ears were more angular than the others, almost blade-like, and his eyes held the sort of cold intensity usually reserved for people who took their jobs very seriously. "Your Majesty," Varen announced, his voice carrying across the vast space, "I present Ambassador Alina Vasquez of Earth." The Queen studied Alina with the sort of patient attention usually reserved for interesting but possibly dangerous specimens. "Ambassador," she said finally, her voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal formations around the room chime softly, "we understand there was difficulty with the traditional greeting." Alina stepped forward, trying to project confidence while internally calculating how quickly she could make it back to the shuttle. "Your Majesty, I apologize for any misunderstanding. On Earth, we have different customs for first meetings." "Different customs," Commander Kairos said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Do not excuse disrespect to our queen." "Now hold on just a minute," Alina said, her construction site reflexes kicking in before her diplomatic training could stop them. "I wasn't disrespecting anyone. I was maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. There's a difference." The throne room fell so quiet that Alina could hear her own heartbeat. Commander Kairos stepped down from the dais, his armor creating soft musical notes with each movement. He was even more imposing up close, and Alina found herself wondering if Zephyrian food contained some sort of growth hormone that humans definitely needed to look into. "Professional boundaries," he repeated, and something in his tone made Alina's diplomatic instincts start screaming warnings. "Perhaps, Ambassador, you would care to discuss these boundaries in a more traditional manner." Alina stared up at Commander Kairos, who loomed over her like a particularly intimidating piece of architectural sculpture that had decided to take personal offense at her existence. The throne room's floating crystal chandeliers seemed to dim slightly, as if even the lighting fixtures were holding their breath. "Traditional manner," Alina repeated, buying time while her brain frantically sorted through everything she knew about Zephyrian customs. Unfortunately, that list was remarkably short and apparently catastrophically incomplete. And what exactly would that involve? Kairos's armor pulsed with deeper colors, cycling through what Alina could only assume were the Zephyrian equivalent of warning signals. "Combat," he said simply, the word resonating through the crystalline chamber like a struck bell. "Single combat to first blood or yield." Alina blinked. "You want to fight me?" "It is the traditional response to grave insult," Kairos replied, his blade-like ears twitching with what might have been anticipation. "Honor demands satisfaction." Behind Alina, Marcus made a sound like a small animal experiencing sudden and terminal distress. She glanced back to see him frantically consulting his datapad, his face cycling through several interesting shades of pale. "Ambassador," Marcus whispered urgently. According to the cultural database, ritual combat is indeed the standard response to, oh dear Lord, to perceived affronts against the crown's dignity. Alina turned back to Kairos, who stood waiting with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and access to significantly better weapons. Right. So let me get this straight. I didn't want to touch foreheads with your liaison, so now you want to stab me. The terms of combat are negotiable. The queen interjected from her throne, her voice carrying musical harmonics that somehow managed to sound both regal and slightly amused. Weapons, duration, victory conditions. How generous, Alina muttered. She looked around the throne room, taking in the assembled courtiers whose elongated ears were all pointed in her direction like organic satellite dishes. And if I decline this generous offer? Kairos's expression darkened. Then you would be declared unworthy of diplomatic status and banished from Zephyrian space permanently. Alina felt her diplomatic career flashing before her eyes, along with Earth's first major interstellar trade agreement. And here, I thought the worst part of this job would be the freeze-dried coffee. She could hear Marcus behind her, making increasingly desperate sounds as he scrolled through his cultural files. The other members of her diplomatic team stood in a tight cluster, looking like they were collectively trying to become invisible through force of will. Ambassador Vasquez, the Queen said, leaning forward slightly on her meteoric throne, we understand this places you in a difficult position. However, our laws regarding matters of honor are ancient and binding. Even I cannot simply set them aside. Alina studied the Queen's face, noting the subtle expressions that played across her features. There was something there, a hint of expectation, as if the Queen was waiting for something specific. Ancient and binding laws, Alina repeated. Right. Well, I've dealt with building codes before, so I know how that goes. She took a deep breath, aware that every pair of eyes in the vast chamber was focused on her. Can I at least ask what happens if I win? A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers like wind through crystal chimes. Kairos actually smiled, though it was the sort of smile usually worn by people who knew where the bodies were buried. If you win, he said, you would have proven your honor beyond question. Such a victory would grant you significant status in our society. And if I lose? First blood or yield, Kairos repeated. Honor is satisfied, and diplomatic relations may proceed. Alina looked down at her hands, which were calloused from years of construction work, but had never held anything more dangerous than a plasma cutter. Then she looked back up at Kairos, whose armor was probably worth more than her entire government salary. This is insane, Marcus whispered behind her. Ambassador, please, there has to be another way. Actually, Alina said slowly, there might be. She stepped closer to Kairos, craning her neck to meet his gaze. You said the terms are negotiable. Within reason, the Queen confirmed. Then I propose we make this interesting. Alina felt her mouth curl into the sort of grin that had gotten her into trouble since childhood. If we're going to do this honor combat thing, let's do it properly. Full ceremony, public arena, the whole theatrical production. Kairos's ears twitched. You wish to make a spectacle of your defeat. I wish to make sure that when I lose with style. Alina shrugged. If I'm going down, I might as well give the people a good show. The Queen's eyebrows rose delicately. How unexpected. Alina turned to address the throne. Your Majesty, I may not understand all your customs, but I understand showmanship. If this is about honor, then let's make it memorable. Grand arena, proper ceremony, maybe some of those floating light displays you seem so fond of. You realize, Kairos said carefully, that this will not make your defeat any less decisive. Oh, I'm counting on losing, Alina replied cheerfully. I've seen you move. I'm pretty sure you could take me apart with a butter knife and a good attitude. But I figure if I'm going to get ceremonially defeated, I might as well make it educational. Marcus made another of his small animal noises. Educational. Sure, Earth's first formal introduction to Zephyrian combat arts. Think of the cultural exchange opportunities, the historical significance. Plus, she added, grinning at Kairos, I bet it'll be fun. The commander stared at her as if she just suggested they solve their differences through interpretive dance. Fun. Why not? I mean, you get to demonstrate your superior fighting skills in front of your entire court. I get to avoid permanent diplomatic exile, and everyone gets entertainment value. It's win-win-win. The queen leaned back in her throne, and Alina could swear she saw the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Commander Kairos, what do you make of this proposal? Kairos looked between Alina and the queen, his expression suggesting he was trying to solve a particularly complex mathematical equation. She wishes to turn ritual combat into entertainment. I wish to turn potential disaster into opportunity, Alina corrected. It's what we humans do best. Very well, the queen said, rising from her throne with fluid grace. Let it be done as you suggest, Ambassador. Tomorrow at sunset, the Grand Arena will host your duel with Commander Kairos. The terms remain first blood or yield. Alina felt her stomach perform several unauthorized acrobatic maneuvers, but kept her expression confident. Perfect. That gives me time to write some very apologetic letters to my superiors. As the court began to disperse, Kairos approached her one final time. Ambassador, he said quietly, I confess I do not understand you. Alina grinned up at him. Commander, if it makes you feel any better, I don't understand me either. But I've found that life's a lot more interesting when you just roll with it. Kairos's ears twitched again, and for just a moment, Alina thought she saw something that might have been amusement in his violet eyes. We shall see, Ambassador. We shall see. The Grand Arena turned out to be less grand and more completely terrifying in ways that defied several fundamental laws of physics. Alina stood at the entrance, watching gravity fields shift and rearrange the combat space like an overly enthusiastic interior decorator with a physics degree. So, she said to Marcus, who was clutching his datapad like a security blanket, on a scale of 1 to, we should have stayed home and raised space chickens. How screwed am I? The gravitational variance alone could crush you into a very small, very flat pancake, Marcus replied with the sort of cheerful honesty that made Alina question his fitness for diplomatic service. And that's before we factor in the energy barriers that can apparently slice through molecular bonds. Alina watched a section of the arena floor rotate 90 degrees while simultaneously flipping upside down. Right. Well, at least it'll be quick. The arena filled rapidly with Zephyrians whose ears were practically vibrating with excitement. Alina had never been the center of attention at what was essentially an alien gladiatorial event, but she was discovering it felt remarkably similar to that time. She'd accidentally walked into a surprise birthday party wearing nothing but a bathrobe and a lot of regret. Ambassador, a court attendant approached with what Alina had learned to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of nervous energy. It is time to receive your ceremonial blade. The weapon they presented her with was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are when you can't afford to break them. It hummed softly in her hands, its crystalline structure catching the arena's shifting lights and throwing rainbows across her diplomatic uniform. Does it come with an instruction manual? Alina asked hopefully. The blade responds to intent and will, the attendant explained earnestly. Simply focus your purpose through the crystal matrix and it'll do what exactly? Make me not terrible at sword fighting. The attendant's ears drooped slightly. Well, no. Thought not. Alina gave the blade a few experimental swings, immediately confirming that she looked exactly as incompetent as she felt. Still, it's very pretty. I bet it'll look great sticking out of me. Commander Kairos emerged from the opposite entrance wearing armor that had apparently been upgraded since yesterday. His new ensemble pulsed with energy patterns that made Alina's eyes water, and his blade crackled with contained lightning that suggested someone had taken the concept of overwhelming advantage and decided to add sound effects. "Oh, come on," Elena called across the arena as the gravity field shifted beneath her feet. "That's just showing off." Kairos tested his weapon with a few practice swings that left glowing trails in the air and made sounds like angry thunder. "This is Vorthak, the Blade of Seven Storms," he announced to the crowd. "It has been wielded by the Royal Guard for 3 centuries. Elena hefted her own weapon, and this is— She looked at the attendant questioningly. "A ceremonial blade for honored guests," came the slightly embarrassed reply. "Right, ceremonial guest stabber it is." Elena grinned at the crowd. "Don't worry, folks, I named my construction tools too. It's a human thing." The Queen entered her viewing box, which floated serenely above the chaos of the arena floor. "Let the duel commence according to ancient tradition," she declared, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd's excitement. "First blood or yield, may honor be satisfied." Elena looked up at the royal box and gave what she hoped was a confident wave. "Your Majesty, just so we're clear, if I somehow accidentally win this thing, do I get to keep the sword?" A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, and Elena was pleased to note that Zephyrian amusement sounded remarkably similar to human amusement, just with better acoustics. The arena's gravity field stabilized into what Elena generously termed moderately lethal, as energy barriers sprang to life around the perimeter. She found herself standing on a platform that hummed with its own power, facing Kairos across 20 meters of space that seemed designed by someone who really enjoyed making simple things complicated. "Any last words, Ambassador?" Kairos called, raising his storm blade in a salute that made the air around him shimmer. "Yeah," Elena replied, settling into what she hoped looked like a fighting stance rather than someone trying not to fall over. "Has anyone ever told you that your armor makes you look like a very intimidating disco ball?" Kairos, she rolled away as he landed where she'd been crouching, his sword sending sparks flying from the arena floor. The gravity field chose that moment to shift again, and Elena found herself sliding sideways toward a section of wall that was rotating with mechanical precision. "You know," she called out, using the wall's rotation to swing herself up onto a higher platform, "where I come from, we have a saying, work smarter, not harder." "And where I come from," Kairos replied, launching himself toward her new position, "we have a saying, honor through strength." "See, that's our problem right there. Different philosophies." Elena grabbed onto a passing energy conduit and used it to swing across to yet another platform. "You're thinking like a warrior. I'm thinking like someone who builds things for a living." She landed badly, stumbled, and only avoided Kairos's next strike by pure accident as the platform beneath her feet decided to rotate 45 degrees. The crowd was making increasingly excited noises, and Elena was beginning to suspect they were enjoying this far more than was strictly appropriate for a formal diplomatic duel. "Stand still and fight with honor," Kairos demanded, his storm blade crackling as he pursued her across the shifting arena. "Honor's great," Elena panted, scrambling up a wall that had helpfully provided handholds by existing at a completely impossible angle. "But I'm more interested in not dying. Call me old-fashioned." The chase continued around the arena, with Elena using every trick she'd learned from years of navigating construction sites in zero gravity, while Kairos demonstrated why he was the Royal Guard commander, by consistently being exactly where she didn't want him to be. "This is not how duels are supposed to proceed," Kairos said, sounding genuinely puzzled as Elena used an energy barrier like a springboard to vault over his head. "Really?" Elena landed, rolled, and came up running. "How are they supposed to go?" "With dignity and proper swordplay, and someone getting stabbed." "Well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad." Elena found herself cornered on a platform that was slowly rotating toward what appeared to be a rather alarming energy discharge. "Though I'm still hoping to avoid the stabbing part." Kairos advanced with his blade raised, and for the first time since the duel began, Alina was out of clever escapes. She raised her ceremonial weapon, knowing it would do about as much good against his storm blade as a toothpick against a plasma cannon. "Finally," Kairos said, "we can end this properly." "Yeah," Alina replied, eyeing the energy discharge that was getting uncomfortably close. "About that." She dove forward, not at Kairos but past him, rolling under his swing and coming up behind him just as the platform completed its rotation. The energy discharge that had been threatening her now crackled directly toward the commander's back. Kairos spun, saw the danger and leaped backward, directly into Alina, who was still trying to get her footing on the rotating platform. They collided, tangled, and went down in a heap that would have been comical if not for the fact that they were both armed and the platform was still moving. Alina found herself on top, her ceremonial blade pressed against Kairos's throat, while his storm blade lay just out of reach where it had fallen during their collision. The arena fell silent except for the humming of energy fields and the soft chiming of the crystal formations. "Well," Alina said finally, "this is awkward." Alina looked down at Commander Kairos, whose violet eyes were wide with what appeared to be equal parts surprise and professional embarrassment. Her ceremonial blade rested against his throat, though she was holding it with about as much confidence as someone might hold a particularly venomous snake. "So," she said conversationally, "I'm pretty sure this counts as first blood, even though nobody's actually bleeding yet." Kairos blinked slowly. "You won." "I fell on you and got lucky," Alina corrected. "There's a difference. Though I have to say, for someone whose armor is supposedly impenetrable, you're remarkably squishy when tackled." The crowd remained silent, as if several thousand Zephyrians were collectively trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Alina could practically hear the sound of their elongated ears perking up in confusion. "Ambassador Vasquez," the Queen's voice carried clearly across the arena, tinged with something that might have been amusement. "Do you yield or do you claim victory?" Alina considered this carefully. On one hand, she had somehow managed to achieve the impossible and defeat the Royal Guard commander through what could generously be called tactical clumsiness. On the other hand, she was fairly certain that claiming victory over someone whose job description included protecting the Queen from armed threats might not be the wisest diplomatic move. "Your Majesty," she called back, "I propose a third option." She stood up carefully, extending her hand down to Kairos. "I call it a draw." Kairos stared at her offered hand, as if it were an alien artifact from a particularly confusing archaeological dig. "A draw? Sure, I mean, you clearly outclassed me in every conceivable way. Better training, better equipment, better technique, and significantly better grooming." Alina waggled her fingers encouragingly. "But I managed to knock you down through sheer dumb luck and possibly divine intervention. So let's call it even." After a moment's hesitation, Kairos grasped her hand and allowed her to help him to his feet. His storm blade materialized back into his grip with a soft chime, while Alina's ceremonial weapon continued to hum cheerfully as if it were particularly pleased with itself. "You fought with unconventional tactics," Kairos said slowly, brushing arena dust from his armor. "I fought like someone who was trying very hard not to die," Alina replied. "Which, let's be honest, was pretty much my entire strategy going in." The Queen descended from her floating observation box, her movements as graceful as water flowing downhill. The crowd parted before her like a living curtain, and Alina found herself wondering if that was a learned skill or something they built into the architecture. "Commander Kairos," the Queen said as she approached, "your assessment of the duel." Kairos straightened to attention, though Alina noticed his ears were still twitching slightly. "Your Majesty, the ambassador fought with honor, though not in any way I have previously encountered. She turned our most solemn ritual into what appeared to be an elaborate game of tag," the Queen observed. Alina winced. "In my defense, Your Majesty, I warned everyone I was going to lose with style." "Indeed you did." The Queen turned her attention fully to Alina, and those luminous eyes seemed to see more than Alina was entirely comfortable with. "Tell me, Ambassador, what did you learn from this experience?" Alina thought about it seriously. "That your arena designers have a truly alarming sense of humor, that ceremonial weapons are surprisingly well balanced, that Commander Kairos is much more gracious in potential defeat than I would have expected." "And?" the Queen prompted. "And?" Alina looked around the arena at the crowd of Zephyrians whose ears were all focused on her like organic satellite dishes, at Marcus, who appeared to be having some sort of diplomatic nervous breakdown, at Kairos, who was studying her with newfound curiosity. And that sometimes the best way to handle an impossible situation is to stop trying to handle it and just roll with it. The Queen smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Precisely." "Wait," Alina said, pieces of a much larger puzzle suddenly clicking into place. "This was all a test, wasn't it?" "Not all of it," the Queen replied. "Your initial cultural misstep was genuine and quite problematic. However, your response to the challenge, your willingness to face impossible odds with humor and grace, your refusal to be intimidated by traditions you didn't understand, these things revealed your true character." Alina felt her cheeks warming. "So the whole honor duel thing was completely legitimate and binding by our laws," Kairos interjected. "But also, as Her Majesty suspected it might be, an opportunity for you to demonstrate that Earth's representatives possess qualities we value highly." "Such as?" Alina asked weakly. "Courage in the face of the unknown," the Queen said. "Adaptability when confronted with unfamiliar challenges. The ability to find unexpected solutions to seemingly impossible problems." She paused. "And most importantly, the wisdom to know when victory is less important than respect." Alina looked back and forth between them. "So when I offered to call it a draw, you proved that Earth understands the difference between winning and succeeding," the Queen finished. "A distinction that will serve our peoples well in the years to come." The crowd erupted in what Alina was learning to recognize as Zephyrian applause, a sound like wind chimes caught in a musical breeze. She found herself grinning despite the lingering adrenaline and the growing realization that she'd somehow managed to stumble through her first major diplomatic crisis without starting an interstellar war. "So," she said to Kairos, "does this mean we're friends now? Or do I still need to watch out for mysterious accidents involving plasma weapons?" Kairos's ears twitched in what Alina was beginning to recognize as his version of amusement. "Ambassador, after watching you turn ritual combat into interpretive acrobatics, I suspect you are quite capable of creating your own accidents without any assistance from me." "Fair point." Alina extended her hand again. "Friends." This time, Kairos didn't hesitate. He grasped her hand in the Earth custom, then stepped closer and gently pressed his forehead to hers in the traditional Zephyrian greeting. "Friends," he agreed. The Queen clapped her hands once, and the arena's energy fields began to power down with musical chimes. "Commander Kairos, please escort our honored guests to the negotiation chambers. I believe we have a great deal to discuss." As they made their way out of the arena, Marcus finally found his voice. "Ambassador," he said in tones of deep reverence, "that was either the most brilliant piece of improvisational diplomacy I've ever witnessed, or the luckiest accident in the history of interstellar relations." Alina considered this seriously. "Marcus, I've been thinking about that, and I've come to a conclusion." "Which is?" "Sometimes," Alina said, watching the Zephyrian sunset paint the crystal spires in shades of gold and crimson, "there's no difference between the two." Behind them, the arena's lights dimmed as the crowd dispersed, chattering excitedly about the human ambassador who had turned their most ancient tradition into something entirely new. And in the growing twilight, Alina Vasquez found herself looking forward to tomorrow's negotiations with an optimism she hadn't felt since accepting this impossible assignment. After all, if she could survive ritual combat with one of the galaxy's most renowned warriors through sheer stubborn creativity, how hard could interstellar trade agreements really be? The answer, she suspected with growing amusement, was going to be the adventure of a lifetime.